I have learned of your circumstances through Master Blackwell, who speaks of your discretion and character. I find myself in need of assistance of a most delicate nature, assistance that requires a gentleman of education, integrity, and above all, silence. Should you be willing to hear my proposition, present yourself at the servants' entrance of Pemberton House at the hour of vespers on Thursday evening. You will be compensated generously for your time, regardless of your decision. Come alone. Tell no one. There had been no signature, only a seal pressed into crimson wax, a rose entwined with thorns. Thomas had spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with his conscience, pacing the narrow confines of the room he shared with his ailing mother in the boarding house near Bootham Bar. Every instinct warned him away from this shadowed path. Scholars did not answer anonymous summons from noblewomen. Men of learning did not entangle themselves in the secrets of the powerful, and yet his mother had coughed blood into her linen that very morning, and the sound of it had silenced every objection his principles could muster. He drew a breath that tasted of snow and wood smoke, straightened his shoulders beneath the weight of his worn cloak, and walked toward the servants' entrance. The door opened before his knuckles could touch the wood. A woman stood in the threshold, not young, not old, dressed in the severe dark wool of a senior household servant. Her gray eyes assessed him in a single sweeping glance that seemed to catalog every patch on his cloak, every ink stain on his fingers, every shadow beneath his eyes. Master Ashford. It was not a question. Yes, madam. You are punctual. That speaks well of you. She stepped aside, revealing a narrow corridor lit by a single tallow candle. Follow me. Speak only when spoken to. Touch nothing. The servant's passage wound through the manor like a secret vein, carrying him past storerooms heavy with the scent of dried herbs, past a kitchen where a great fire roared and servants moved in choreographed silence, past closed doors behind which he heard the distant murmur of voices speaking in French. The housekeeper moved with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent a lifetime making herself invisible, and Thomas found himself mimicking her careful steps. They climbed a narrow stair, then another. The walls changed from rough-hewn stone to plastered surfaces hung with tapestries depicting hunting scenes. The air grew warmer, sweeter, touched with the scent of beeswax candles and rosewater. The housekeeper stopped before a door of carved oak. "You will have but a quarter hour," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My lady will explain everything. Remember, discretion is not merely expected, it is the price of your life. Do you understand?" Thomas nodded, his throat too tight for words. The housekeeper's expression softened by some infinitesimal degree. "She is not what you imagine," she said, and before Thomas could ask what that meant, she had opened the door and ushered him inside. The chamber was lit by a dozen candles and the amber glow of a fire burning in a great stone hearth. Tapestries covered the walls, scenes of courtly love, of knights kneeling before ladies, of gardens where roses bloomed eternal. A bed stood in the corner, its curtains drawn, and near the window a writing desk scattered with parchments and quills. But Thomas noticed none of this. He noticed only her. Lady Isabel Pemberton stood before the fire with her back to the door, her silhouette traced in gold by the dancing flames. Her gown was the deep green of forest shadows, and her hair, the color of autumn leaves touched by the first frost, fell in a single braid down her back. She held herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to being watched, judged, measured against standards she had no hand in creating. She did not turn when the door closed behind him. "Master Ashford." Her voice was low, musical, carrying the careful diction of the nobility. "Thank you for coming." "My lady." Thomas bowed, though she could not see the gesture. "Please." She turned then, and Thomas felt his breath catch like a bird trapped against glass. She was beautiful. Of course she was beautiful. Wives of dukes were always beautiful. But it was not her beauty that struck him. It was the sorrow in her eyes, a sorrow so vast and so carefully contained that it reminded him of the sea he had once glimpsed as a child, endless and unknowable. She was younger than he had expected. perhaps 20 years of age, perhaps less, and there was something in the way she held her hands, clasped before her as if in prayer, knuckles white with tension, that spoke of fear rather than command. "Please do not bow," she continued. "In this room, there are no titles. There is only Isabel and Thomas. Two souls who may be able to help each other if we are brave enough to try." She gestured toward a chair near the fire. Thomas sat, though every muscle in his body protested the intimacy of the arrangement. A lady and a scholar alone in her bedchamber, the scandal alone could destroy them both. Isabel remained standing, her fingers working at the embroidery of her sleeve in a gesture that betrayed her nervousness. "I suppose you are wondering why I have summoned you here." "The thought had occurred to me, my lady." "Isabel," she corrected gently, "and I shall tell you plainly, for I have learned that honesty is a luxury I can no longer afford to waste." She drew a breath that seemed to require all her courage. "I need an heir, and my husband cannot, will not, provide one." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "My lady, Isabel, surely you cannot mean—" "I mean precisely what I say." She moved to the window, her gaze fixed on the snow falling beyond the glass. "I have been married to the Duke of Pemberton for 2 years. It was an arrangement, as these things always are. My father's lands in exchange for a title and protection, my dowry for an alliance that would benefit both houses." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had hardened with something that sounded almost like hatred. "What no one told me, what I was not permitted to know, was that my husband has no interest in women. His preferences lie elsewhere, with the young squires who serve in his household, with the sons of lesser nobles who seek his favor." Thomas said nothing. He had heard whispers of such things, of course. In the monasteries where he had studied, such sins were spoken of in hushed tones, condemned from the pulpit but tolerated in the shadows. "For 2 years I have been a wife in name only," Isabel continued. "For 2 years I have endured the whispers of the court, the pitying glances of the other ladies, the increasingly pointed questions from my father about when I might produce an heir." She turned to face him, and Thomas saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The Duke's patience is wearing thin. If I do not give him a son within the year, he will petition for annulment. He will claim that I am barren, that the failure is mine. I will be returned to my father in disgrace, and everything, my family's honor, my younger sister's marriage prospects, my mother's position at court, will crumble to ash. And you wish me to—" Thomas could not finish the sentence. "I wish you to give me what my husband cannot." Isabel's voice was steady now, as if speaking the words aloud had drained the fear from them. "One night, that is all I ask. One night, and then we shall never speak of it again. You will have your 8 sovereigns, enough to save your mother's life, and I will have my chance at an heir." Thomas rose from the chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. "My lady, what you propose is a sin, I know." She laughed, and the sound was bitter as winter wind. "Do you think I have not knelt before the altar and begged God's forgiveness 1,000 times? Do you think I have not wept until my eyes burned, knowing what I must do to survive?" She stepped toward him, close enough that he could smell the rosewater on her skin, the lavender in her hair. "I am not asking you to love me, Thomas Ashford. I am asking you to save me, as I am offering to save you." The fire crackled in the hearth. Snow whispered against the window. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, a door opened and closed, and voices murmured in a language Thomas could not understand. He thought of his mother, lying in her narrow bed with the consumption eating at her lungs. He thought of the physician's letter, folded in his pocket like a death sentence. He thought of all the prayers he had offered, all the candles he had lit, all the bargains he had tried to strike with a God who seemed determined not to listen. And he thought of the woman standing before him, beautiful and desperate, and asking for something that would damn them both. "If we are discovered," he began. "We will not be discovered. The Duke is in London until Candlemas. The servants are loyal to me, not to him. I have made certain of that. And you—" She reached out, her fingers brushing his jaw with a touch as light as falling snow. "You are a scholar with no connections, no family of consequence, no one who would believe your word against a duke's. If anything were to go wrong, you would simply disappear. Another poor soul lost to the winter cold." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm practicality of someone who had learned to see the world as it truly was, rather than as she wished it to be. Thomas closed his eyes. Behind his lids he saw his mother's face, pale and thin, but still beautiful, still alive. He heard her voice reading to him from the scriptures when he was a child, teaching him that there was good in the world, that God rewarded those who walked the righteous path. What would she say if she knew the price of her survival? What would she say if she died because he had been too proud to pay it? "One night," he heard himself say, "and my mother receives the medicine she needs." Isabel's breath escaped in a rush, and for a moment her composure cracked. He saw the relief flood her features, saw the tears she had been holding back finally spill down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Thomas. You cannot know what this means." But he did know. He knew exactly what it meant. It meant salvation and damnation, intertwined like the rose and thorns on her seal. It meant a choice from which there would be no return. The housekeeper appeared as if summoned by some unspoken signal, opening the door just wide enough to catch Thomas's eye. "Tomorrow night," Isabel said quickly, wiping the tears from her cheeks with practiced efficiency. "Return at the same hour. Martha will show you to a different chamber, one where we will not be disturbed." She pressed something into his hand, a small leather purse, heavy with coin. "Half now, the rest when it is done." Thomas looked down at the purse in his hand. 4 gold sovereigns, more money than he had held in his entire life. Enough to buy the first round of medicines, enough to buy his mother another month of life. "Until tomorrow, then," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Isabel nodded, and for a moment their eyes met. In the candlelight, her gaze was unreadable, grateful perhaps, or frightened, or something else entirely that Thomas lacked the experience to name. Then Martha was at his elbow, guiding him back through the servants' passages, back down the narrow stairs, back out into the snow-covered night where the cold hit his face like a slap. He stood outside the gates of Pemberton House for a long moment, the purse clutched in his fist, the weight of what he had agreed to settling over his shoulders like a shroud. The snow continued to fall, silent and relentless, covering the cobblestones in white. Covering everything. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These are the stories that remind us what it means to feel deeply, to love desperately, and to make impossible choices. Subscribe now, and let us walk this journey together. The following evening arrived with the slow inevitability of a funeral procession. Thomas spent the day at his mother's bedside, watching Master Blackwell administer the first dose of the medicine that the physician had promised would ease her breathing. The herbs smelled of foreign lands, cinnamon and myrrh and something sharp that Thomas could not identify. And as Eleanor Ashford drank the bitter tea, some of the color returned to her hollow cheeks. "You are a good son," she murmured, her thin fingers finding his. "I do not know how you found the money, but I know it cost you something. I can see it in your eyes." Thomas said nothing. He only kissed her forehead and told her to rest. The walk to Pemberton House felt longer than it had the night before. Every shadow seemed to watch him. Every church bell that tolled the hour seemed to be counting down the moments until his fall from grace. Martha was waiting at the servants' entrance, her gray eyes reflecting nothing of whatever judgment she might have held. "This way," she said simply, and led him through a different set of passages, narrower, darker, clearly designed for discretion. They emerged in a part of the manor that felt older, the stone walls thick with centuries of secrets. The chamber she showed him to was small but richly appointed. A fire burned in the hearth. Candles flickered on every surface. The bed was hung with curtains of deep crimson, and the air was heavy with the scent of roses, so many roses that Thomas felt almost dizzy with their sweetness. "Wait here," Martha said. "My lady will come to you when the household has retired." She left, and Thomas was alone. He stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do with his hands, his eyes, his racing thoughts. He was not an innocent. He had studied medicine, had seen diagrams, and read texts that would make a lesser man blush. But theory and practice were vastly different things, and the reality of what was about to happen pressed against his chest like a physical weight. An hour passed, perhaps 2. Thomas had lost the ability to measure time, and then the door opened and Isabel stepped inside. She wore a nightgown of white linen, her hair unbound and falling in waves past her shoulders. Without the elaborate gown and carefully arranged braids, she looked younger, more vulnerable, less like a duchess and more like a frightened girl playing a part she had never asked to perform. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. "I almost did not come," she admitted. 3 times I turned back. 3 times I told myself that there must be another way. "Is there?" Thomas asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, I have looked. I have prayed. I have begged every saint whose name I know for a miracle that never came." She stepped away from the door, toward the fire, toward him. "This is my only path forward, and yours." They stood facing each other in the firelight, 2 souls bound by desperation, about to commit an act that could destroy them both. "I want you to know," Isabel said softly, "that I do not take this lightly. I know what I am asking you to sacrifice, your honor, your principles, perhaps even your soul." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers cold against his cheek. "If there were any other way—" "There is not," Thomas said, "for either of us." She nodded, and something in her eyes shifted, from fear to resolve, from hesitation to acceptance. "Then let us not speak of sin tonight," she whispered. "Let us speak only of survival, of 2 people helping each other through the darkness." She took his hand and led him toward the bed. What happened next would remain locked in the chambers of Thomas's memory for the rest of his life. A night of whispered words and tentative touches, of fear slowly giving way to tenderness, of 2 strangers learning the landscape of each other's loneliness. It was not love. Thomas knew that, even as Isabel's arms wrapped around him, even as her breath warmed his neck, even as they moved together in the ancient rhythm that had bound men and women since the dawn of time. It was not love, but it was not nothing either. In the darkness, with the fire burning low and the roses perfuming the air, Thomas saw beyond the Duchess, beyond the desperate schemer, to the woman beneath. He saw the girl who had been sold into a loveless marriage. He saw the wife who had spent 2 years in elegant captivity, watching her youth slip away in silent rooms. He saw the fear that she carried like a second heartbeat, the loneliness that had calcified into a shell of graceful composure, and Isabel in turn seemed to see him, not the poor scholar, not the instrument of her salvation, but the man who had chosen to shoulder a burden that would haunt him forever, for love of his mother, for the desperate hope of preserving a single human life. When it was over, they lay side by side in the crimson-curtained bed, their breathing slowly returning to normal. "You are not what I expected," Isabel said quietly. "Nor you." Thomas stared at the canopy above them, unable to meet her eyes. "I thought you would be colder, more calculating." "I was." She turned her head to look at him, and in the dim light he could see the sheen of tears on her cheeks. "I had to be. To survive this long, I had to become someone I barely recognize." She reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "But tonight I remembered what it felt like to be seen, to be touched by someone who did not view me as property or political advantage." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you for that." Thomas did not know what to say. The words that rose to his lips, words of comfort, of connection, perhaps even of affection, felt dangerous. This was meant to be a transaction, a single night never to be repeated or acknowledged. But as Isabel's fingers remained intertwined with his, as her warmth pressed against his side in the cooling room, Thomas felt something shift in his chest. Something that felt terrifyingly like the first stirrings of love. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to rise. "Before dawn, before anyone—" "Stay." The word was barely a whisper. "Please, just until the candles burn down. Let me pretend for a few more hours that I am not alone." Thomas closed his eyes. He stayed. Winter tightened its grip on York as December gave way to January, and Thomas Ashford found himself caught between two worlds. By day, he was the dutiful son, tending to his mother as the medicine slowly worked its healing. Eleanor Ashford's cough eased. Her cheeks regained their color. She began to sit up in bed, then to walk across the room, then to venture downstairs to the common parlor where she could watch the snow fall through frosted windows. Each improvement was a small miracle, a vindication of the choice Thomas had made. But at night, alone in his narrow bed, Thomas was haunted. Not by guilt, though guilt was there certainly, a constant companion that whispered accusations in the darkness. What haunted him was Isabel's face in the firelight, her voice as she whispered his name. The way her fingers had trembled as she touched him, as if she were reaching for something precious and fragile, something she feared would shatter at the slightest pressure. He told himself it was merely the memory of a single night, already fading like morning mist. He told himself that whatever had passed between them was finished, sealed away like a letter never to be opened again. He told himself that the Lady Pemberton had no doubt already forgotten his name, his face, everything but the service he had rendered. But the lies rang hollow, even in the privacy of his own mind. 3 weeks after their night together, Martha appeared at the door of the boarding house. Thomas was transcribing a merchant's contract in the cramped room he used as a study when the knock came. His mother was sleeping in the next room, her breath finely quiet and regular, and he opened the door with a finger pressed to his lips. Martha's face was as expressionless as ever, but there was something in her eyes, something Thomas could not identify, that made his heart begin to race. "My lady wishes to see you," she said simply. "Tonight. The same hour. The same entrance." "Why?" The question escaped before Thomas could stop it. "We agreed. One night. The bargain is complete. The bargain may be complete." Martha's voice dropped even lower. "But there are developments. My lady will explain. Will you come?" Thomas should have refused. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to close the door, to forget that the Lady Pemberton existed, to take his mother and flee York before the Duke returned from London. But instead, he heard himself say, "Yes." That evening, the walk to Pemberton House felt different. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear, the stars burning bright and cold above the city. Thomas's breath fogged in the frigid air as he approached the servants' entrance, and this time, his heart pounded not with fear, but with something closer to anticipation. Martha led him through the now familiar passages, but instead of the rose-scented chamber, she brought him to a small parlor on the upper floor, a room clearly designed for private conversation, with 2 chairs drawn close to a modest fire. Isabel was already there. She sat in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale and drawn. She was dressed simply, a dark gown with minimal embroidery, her hair gathered in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. She looked tired, Thomas realized, tired and afraid. "Thomas." She did not rise when he entered, did not smile, did not extend her hand in greeting. "Thank you for coming. Your housekeeper said there were developments." Thomas remained standing, maintaining what distance the small room allowed. "What has happened?" Isabel drew a breath that seemed to require all her courage. "I am with child." The word struck Thomas like a physical blow. He gripped the back of the nearest chair, steadying himself against the sudden vertigo that swept through him. "You are certain?" "The physician confirmed it this morning." Her voice was flat, carefully controlled. "I am perhaps 4 weeks along. The timing is exactly as we planned." Thomas sank into the chair, his legs no longer able to support him. "Then you have what you wanted, an heir. Your position is secure." "Yes." Isabel's gaze dropped to her folded hands. "My position is secure. My family's honor will be preserved. My sisters will make their matches. Everything I sacrificed will have been worth it." She should have sounded triumphant. She should have sounded relieved, at the very least. Instead, her voice carried a weight of sorrow that Thomas did not understand. "Then why do you look as though you have received a death sentence?" Isabel finally met his eyes, and Thomas saw that they were bright with unshed tears. "Because I have been a fool," she whispered. "Because I thought I could orchestrate this transaction, this exchange of services, without consequence. Because I thought—" Her voice broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth, struggling to regain composure. "Because I thought I could spend a night in your arms and emerge unchanged." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed the hour. "What are you saying?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. He had felt it too, that inexplicable connection, that sense of recognition, as if they had known each other in some other life, some other story. "I am saying that I think of you constantly." The words tumbled from Isabel's lips like water breaking through a dam. "I am saying that I lie awake at night remembering the sound of your voice, the warmth of your hands, the way you looked at me as if I were something more than a title and a dowry. I am saying—" She drew a shuddering breath. "I am saying that I love you, Thomas Ashford. God help me, I love you, and I do not know what to do." Thomas closed his eyes. The words he had forbidden himself to speak, the feelings he had locked away in the deepest chambers of his heart, they surged forward now, demanding acknowledgement. "And I love you," he heard himself say. "I have loved you since the moment you turned from that window, and I saw the sorrow in your eyes. I have loved you through every sleepless night, every hour of pretending that what we shared meant nothing." He opened his eyes and looked at her. This woman who was so far above him in station, so utterly beyond his reach, and yet somehow closer to him than anyone had ever been. "But it changes nothing, Isabel. It cannot change anything. You are a duchess. I am a penniless scholar. And you carry a child who must be presented to the world as the Duke of Pemberton's heir." "I know." Tears were falling freely down her cheeks now. "I know all of this. I have recited these facts to myself 1,000 times, but knowing and accepting are not the same thing, and I—" She rose abruptly, crossing to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold the pieces of herself together. "I needed you to know, before the Duke returns, before I must resume the performance of my marriage. I needed you to know that what happened between us was not merely a transaction for me. It was real. You are real, and I will carry that with me for the rest of my life." Thomas rose and moved to stand beside her. He did not touch her, he did not dare, but he stood close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, could smell the lavender in her hair. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now you go back to your life. Your mother is healing. Your future is secure. You will finish your studies, take your place in the world, perhaps find a woman who can love you openly, without shadows and secrets." She turned to face him, and her smile was the saddest thing Thomas had ever seen. "And I will raise my child, our child, in a gilded cage, watching from a distance as you build the life I cannot share." "Isabel, no." She pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Do not make promises you cannot keep. Do not speak words that will only make the parting harder." She lowered her hand, letting her palm rest briefly against his chest, over his heart. "But know this, Thomas Ashford. For one night, you made me feel alive. For one night, you made me feel loved. And no matter what happens, no matter how many years pass, I will never forget." Thomas caught her hand before she could withdraw it. He raised it to his lips and pressed a kiss to her palm, a gesture of reverence, of farewell, of love that could never be spoken again. "Nor will I," he said. "Nor will I, Isabel. If this story is touching your heart, leave a comment saying, 'Some loves are eternal, even when they cannot be lived.' I want to know if you feel what these two souls are feeling." February brought with it a thaw that turned the snow-covered streets of York into rivers of mud, and with the thaw came the Duke of Pemberton. Thomas heard of his arrival from the gossip in the marketplace. The servants spoke of little else. The Duke had returned from London a week earlier than expected, and rumor had it that his mood was as dark as a winter storm. Some said he had lost heavily at cards. Others whispered of political intrigues, of favors called in and debts come due. Thomas heard the rumors and felt fear settle into his bones like cold water. He had seen Isabel only once in the week since their final conversation. A chance glimpse as her carriage passed through the streets, her face visible for a moment through the window. Their eyes had met across the crowded thoroughfare, and in that brief instant, Thomas had seen everything: the longing, the sorrow, the desperate wish that things could be different. Then the carriage had passed, and she was gone, and Thomas had stood in the muddy street feeling as though a part of his soul had been torn away. Now, with the Duke returned, even those fleeting glimpses would be impossible. Thomas knew he should be grateful. Distance was the only protection they had. Distance was what would keep Isabel safe, keep their secret buried, keep the child she carried from ever being questioned. But gratitude was not what he felt as he walked through the twilight streets toward the boarding house. What he felt was grief. He was so lost in thought that he almost did not notice the man following him. It was only when Thomas turned down the narrow alley that led to his door that he became aware of the footsteps behind him, heavy, deliberate, matching his pace exactly. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a figure in a dark cloak, face hidden by a hood, keeping to the shadows. Thomas's heart began to pound. He quickened his pace, but the footsteps behind him quickened as well. He turned a corner, then another, but no matter which direction he chose, the figure remained behind him, maintaining the same distance, neither closing in nor falling back. Finally, Thomas stopped. He turned to face his pursuer, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Who are you?" he demanded. "What do you want?" The figure stepped forward, and in the dying light, Thomas saw the face beneath the hood: sharp features, cold eyes, a thin smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "My name is Edmund Blackwood," the man said. "I am the Duke of Pemberton's personal secretary, and you, Master Ashford, are a man with a very interesting secret." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "I do not know what you mean." "No?" Blackwood's smile widened. "Then allow me to be more direct. You visited Pemberton House on the evening of December 17th. You were admitted through the servants' entrance and led to Lady Pemberton's private chambers. You remained there until nearly dawn." He paused, letting the words settle like stones into still water. "Shall I continue, or do you take my meaning?" Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I thought as much." Blackwood stepped closer, until Thomas could smell the wine on his breath, the expensive cologne that failed to mask something darker beneath. "Now, here is what is going to happen. You are going to leave York. Tonight. You will take your mother and whatever belongings you can carry, and you will disappear. You will never return to this city, never attempt to contact Lady Pemberton, never speak of what occurred between you. In exchange, I will forget what I know. The Duke will never learn of his wife's indiscretion. Everyone will be allowed to continue their lives as if nothing happened." "And if I refuse?" Blackwood's smile vanished. "Then I will go to the Duke with what I know. I have witnesses, servants who can be persuaded to remember what they saw. I have your name, your address, your mother's location." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The Duke is not a merciful man, Master Ashford. When he learns that his wife has cuckolded him, he will destroy her. And you? He chuckled, a sound like bones rattling in a grave. You will simply cease to exist. There are so many ways for a penniless scholar to meet an unfortunate end in a city like York. Thomas's mind raced. Flight was impossible. His mother was still too weak to travel, and even if she weren't, where would they go? They had no money, no connections, no resources beyond what remained of the coins Isabel had given him, but neither could he stay and do nothing while Isabel's world collapsed around her. Why? He asked suddenly. Why do you care? What does Lady Pemberton's indiscretion matter to you? Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes, something that looked almost like satisfaction. Let us say that Lady Pemberton and I have unfinished business. Let us say that I have waited a very long time for an opportunity such as this. He straightened, adjusting his cloak with theatrical precision. You have until midnight. If you are still in York when the cathedral bells strike 12, the Duke will receive a very illuminating letter. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Thomas stood alone in the alley, the cold seeping through his thin cloak, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down upon his shoulders. Run, and abandon the woman he loved to face Blackwood's threats alone. Stay and risk everything, his life, his mother's safety, the secret that could destroy them all. The cathedral bells began to toll, counting the hours until midnight. Thomas made his decision. Rather than fleeing, Thomas Ashford walked directly to the great doors of Pemberton House. The guards at the entrance regarded him with suspicion. A shabbily dressed scholar had no business at the Duke's residence, particularly at such an hour. But Thomas drew himself up to his full height and spoke with a conviction he did not entirely feel. I have urgent information for His Grace the Duke of Pemberton. Information regarding a conspiracy within his own household. Tell him that a man named Blackwood is not what he seems. The guards exchanged glances. Then one of them disappeared inside, leaving Thomas to stand in the bitter cold, his fate suspended like a leaf caught between winds. Minutes passed. A quarter hour. Thomas had begun to believe he would be left to freeze when the door opened and a different servant appeared, an older man in the Duke's livery, his expression carefully neutral. His Grace will see you, the man said. Follow me. The interior of Pemberton House was even more magnificent than Thomas had glimpsed through servants' passages. Tapestries and portraits lined the walls. Candelabras of silver and gold cast light across marble floors. Every surface gleamed with the patina of old wealth, old power, old secrets. Thomas was led to a study on the ground floor, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive desk of carved oak. Behind the desk sat a man Thomas recognized from his single glimpse through a window months ago. Henry Pemberton, Duke of Pemberton, a man of perhaps 50 years with iron gray hair, a face marked by the lines of a lifetime's worth of cold calculation, and eyes that assessed Thomas as one might assess a specimen in a menagerie. You are the scholar. It was not a question. The one who claims to have information about Blackwood. Yes, Your Grace. And what is this information? The Duke's voice was like gravel, rough and hard and utterly without warmth. Thomas drew a breath. What he was about to do was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice that would either save them all or destroy everything. But he had no other cards to play. Edmund Blackwood is blackmailing your wife, Your Grace. He claims to have evidence of an indiscretion, evidence that he is using to extort compliance with his demands. But the evidence is fabricated. There was no indiscretion. There is only a man who has cultivated lies and purchased false testimony in order to gain leverage over a woman who refused his advances. The Duke's expression did not change. You are accusing my secretary of blackmail. I am, Your Grace. And what proof do you offer? My testimony. And the testimony of your wife, should you choose to speak with her. A heavy silence fell over the study. The Duke's fingers tapped slowly against the surface of his desk, once, twice, 3 times, as he studied Thomas with the cold intensity of a hawk eyeing potential prey. You are either very brave, the Duke said finally, or very foolish. Perhaps both. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back to Thomas. Blackwood has served me for 15 years. He knows my secrets, my debts, my weaknesses. He has made himself indispensable, which I have come to realize was precisely his intention. Thomas waited, scarcely daring to breathe. What you do not know, the Duke continued, is that I have suspected Blackwood for some time. Small inconsistencies in the ledgers, servants who disappear without explanation, whispers that cease whenever I enter a room. He turned to face Thomas, and for the first time, something almost like weariness flickered across his aristocratic features. I brought him with me from London because I intended to confront him here, away from his network of spies and informants. But I lacked proof. I lacked a witness who could speak to his methods. He crossed to Thomas and stood directly before him, close enough that Thomas could see the flecks of gold in the Duke's gray eyes. You have given me that witness, the Duke said, and in return, I find myself inclined to give you something as well. Your grace, your life to begin with, and your mother's safety. The Duke's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. Blackwood has overreached himself. Whatever hold he thought he had over my wife, whatever evidence he claimed to possess, it ends tonight. I will deal with him personally. Thomas felt relief wash through him like spring water, but beneath it, fear still lingered. And Lady Pemberton? The Duke studied him for a long moment. My wife and I have an understanding. It is not a love match. It was never intended to be. But she has performed her duties admirably, and I am not so foolish as to discard an alliance over rumors and innuendo. He paused, particularly when she is carrying my heir. Something in his tone made Thomas's blood run cold. Did the Duke know? Had he somehow discovered the truth? But the Duke simply turned away, returning to his desk, dismissing Thomas with a wave of his hand. You have done me a service tonight, scholar. I will not forget it. But I suggest you leave York nonetheless. There are those who will not look kindly upon a man who brought down Edmund Blackwood, and I cannot guarantee your safety against every shadow. Your Grace, Go. The word was final, brooking no argument. Go and do not return. That is my gift to you, and my warning. Thomas bowed and retreated from the study, his mind reeling. He had saved Isabel. He had saved himself. He had brought down the man who had threatened to destroy them all. But as he walked back through the snow-covered streets, Thomas could not shake the feeling that the Duke had seen far more than he revealed. That those cold eyes had read the truth in Thomas's face and chosen, for reasons of his own, to let it remain unspoken. Some mercies, Thomas reflected, were more frightening than punishments. Spring came slowly to York that year, the snows receding in fits and starts, the first crocuses pushing through frozen ground like promises of renewal. Thomas Ashford spent those weeks in a state of suspended animation, caring for his mother, completing his studies, making preparations for a departure that felt less like an escape and more like an amputation. He had received word, through channels he dared not trace, that Edmund Blackwood had been arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. The Duke, it seemed, had found ample evidence of financial misconduct, enough to see Blackwood stripped of his position, his reputation, and eventually his freedom. There had been no mention of Lady Pemberton, no whispers of scandal, no hint of the secret that lay buried beneath the official narrative. Isabel was safe. The child was safe. That knowledge should have been enough. It should have brought Thomas peace, allowed him to move forward with a clear conscience and an unburdened heart. But the heart, Thomas was learning, did not operate according to the dictates of logic. On the eve of his departure, his mother finally strong enough to travel, a position secured for him at a monastery in the south of England, a final letter arrived. It came as the first had, delivered by an anonymous servant, sealed with crimson wax, bearing the imprint of a rose entwined with thorns. Thomas's hands trembled as he broke the seal. My dearest Thomas, by the time you read this, you will already be preparing to leave. I know this because I know you. I know your honor, your courage, your determination to do what is right regardless of the cost to yourself. It is one of the 1,000 things I love about you. I cannot ask you to stay. I have no right to ask you for anything after all that you have given. But I could not let you go without speaking the words that have lived in my heart since the night we shared. The child I carry will never know the truth of their parentage. They will grow up as the Duke's heir, raised in privilege and expectation, taught to be everything that rank and station demand. But I will know. And in the quiet moments, in the spaces between duty and performance, I will whisper to them the story of a scholar who saved their mother's life, not with money or power, but with kindness, with courage, with love. You gave me hope when I had none. You reminded me that I was more than a contract, more than a duty, more than a possession to be bargained over. Whatever else happens, whatever the years may bring, I will carry that gift with me always. I am told that the monastery at Southwell has an exceptional library. I am told that scholars there sometimes rise to positions of great influence, that the church values learning above lineage, that a man of humble origins can build a life of meaning and purpose. Build that life, Thomas. Find happiness. Fall in love with someone who can stand beside you openly, who can give you children that bear your name, who can grow old with you without shadows between you. And know that somewhere, in a great house in York, there is a woman who will think of you every time the snow falls, who will say a prayer for you every time she sees a scholar bent over his books, who will love you quietly and eternally until her last breath. Yours, in ways that can never be spoken, Isabel Thomas read the letter 3 times, committing every word to memory. Then he held it to the candle flame and watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash. Some things were too precious to keep, too dangerous to preserve, but the words lived on in his heart, where no flame could touch them. The following morning, Thomas Ashford left York. He did not look back at the city walls, did not glance toward the spires of the Minster or the limestone facade of Pemberton House. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, on the future that awaited him, on the life he would build from the ashes of the one he was leaving behind. His mother dozed in the cart beside him, wrapped in blankets, her breath finally clear and easy. She did not know the full cost of her recovery. She would never know. Some burdens were meant to be carried alone. The road stretched southward, winding through villages and farmland, through forests where the first green shoots were beginning to appear on the bare branches. Spring was coming, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. But for Thomas Ashford, spring would always smell of roses. 7 years passed. The monastery at Southwell proved to be everything Thomas had hoped for and more. Within its ancient walls, he found purpose, community, and a vocation that satisfied the deepest longings of his scholarly heart. He rose through the ranks with quiet distinction. First a humble copyist, then a teacher, then the keeper of the library itself, responsible for manuscripts that dated back centuries. His mother lived out her final years in a small cottage near the monastery, tended by the monks and visited daily by her devoted son. When she died in the spring of Thomas's 31st year, she went peacefully, surrounded by the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard outside her window. "You have been such a good son," she whispered in her final moments. "Whatever you sacrificed for me, whatever you gave up, I pray that God will reward you 1,000-fold." Thomas held her hand until the breath left her body, and when he wept not only for her passing but for all the secrets he had never shared, all the love he had never spoken, all the might-have-beens that had slipped through his fingers like water. He buried her beneath the apple trees and returned to his books, to his manuscripts, to the quiet life he had built in the shadow of the great cathedral. But even in that tranquil existence, memories intruded. He thought of Isabel on winter nights, when the snow fell soft and silent outside his cell window. He thought of her when he found roses growing in the monastery garden, their petals the deep crimson of the curtains that had shrouded her bed. He thought of her when he read tales of courtly love, of impossible devotion, of hearts that burned across the distances that separated them. He never tried to contact her. He never sought news of her life, her husband, her child. To do so would have been to risk everything they had both sacrificed to protect. But sometimes, in the liminal hours between midnight and dawn, Thomas allowed himself to imagine. He imagined a child with Isabel's autumn leaf hair and his own dark eyes. He imagined that child learning to read, to write, to navigate the treacherous waters of noble society. He imagined Isabel watching that child grow, seeing echoes of him in every gesture, every expression, every flash of curiosity or defiance. He imagined, and he hoped, and he prayed. And in that way, he survived. It was an autumn afternoon when the letter came. Thomas was in the library, cataloging a new acquisition, a collection of Greek medical texts that had journeyed from Constantinople through Venice and finally to England, when a novice appeared at his elbow. "Master Ashford, there is a lady here to see you." Thomas looked up, his brow furrowed. Ladies did not visit the monastery library. Ladies did not, as a rule, visit monasteries at all, unless they were seeking the intercession of saints or the counsel of confessors. A lady? Did she give her name? She said only that she was an old friend, and that you would want to see her. Thomas's heart, which had beaten steadily for 7 years, suddenly lurched in his chest. It cannot be. After all this time, it cannot be. But even as he thought the words, he knew they were a lie. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, who was waiting for him in the visitor's parlor. He set down his quill, straightened his robes, and walked on legs that felt as though they belonged to someone else. The parlor was a small room, simply furnished with wooden chairs and a crucifix on the wall. Light streamed through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the flagstone floor. And standing in that light, her back to the door, was a woman whose silhouette Thomas would have recognized anywhere. She was older now, of course. They both were. The girlish softness had given way to the refined elegance of a woman in her late 20s, and her hair, still the color of autumn leaves, was arranged in a style that spoke of wealth and station. But when she turned at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes were the same sorrow, the same depth, the same inexplicable light that had called to him across a fire-lit chamber 7 years ago. "Thomas." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Isabel." He stopped in the center of the room, unsure whether to move closer, afraid of what might happen if he did. "What are you doing here? How—" "The Duke is dead." The words fell like stones into still water. 3 months ago. A hunting accident. His horse threw him, and he struck his head on a stone. She drew a shuddering breath. "I am no longer the Duchess of Pemberton. I am simply Isabel." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. "And the child?" For the first time, Isabel smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, and touched with a mother's pride. "His name is Edward. He is 6 years old. He has your eyes, Thomas. Your curiosity. Your kindness." She took a step toward him. "He is the Duke now, of course, under the guardianship of his uncle until he comes of age. But he is happy. He is healthy. And he knows nothing of—" She paused, swallowing hard. "He believes he is Henry Pemberton's son. That is as it must be." "Then why are you here?" Thomas asked. "Why now, after all these years?" Isabel closed the remaining distance between them, stopping close enough that he could smell the lavender in her hair, the same lavender that had haunted his dreams for 7 long years. "Because I am free," she said simply. "Because the mourning period is ending, and soon the world will expect me to remarry, to forge another alliance, to sell myself once more for the sake of duty and family honor." Her hand rose to touch his face, her fingers trembling against his cheek. "And because I could not face that future without seeing you one more time, without telling you that I never stopped loving you, without asking—" Her voice broke. She pressed her lips together, visibly struggling for composure. "Without asking what?" Thomas prompted gently. "Without asking if there is any hope." Tears were falling freely down her cheeks now. "I know I have no right to ask. I know the church is your life, your vocation, everything you have built these 7 years. I know that what I am proposing is scandalous, impossible, perhaps even sinful." She drew a ragged breath. "But I am no longer a duchess bound by duty. I am a widow with a modest fortune and a son who needs no more than I can already give him. And I am a woman who has loved one man for 7 years and never found a way to stop." Thomas stood very still. Outside the window, the autumn wind stirred the leaves of an ancient oak, sending them spiraling downward in shades of gold and crimson. The light shifted, the shadows lengthened, and for a moment it seemed as though time itself had paused, waiting to see which way the world would turn. He thought of the vows he had taken. He thought of the life he had built. He thought of his mother's final words, her prayer that God would reward his sacrifices. And then he thought of Isabel's face in the firelight 7 years ago, of the way she had whispered his name, of the love that had never died, only slumbered, waiting for this moment of awakening. "The church has been my refuge," he said slowly. "My purpose, my salvation." He reached up and covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more firmly against his cheek. "But it was always a consolation, Isabel, a way of filling the void that you left behind." Her breath caught. "Thomas, I never took final vows." The words came out in a rush, as if they had been waiting years to be spoken. "I kept finding reasons to delay. I told myself it was duty to my mother, then devotion to my work, then simple caution. But the truth," he laughed, a sound that held more wonder than humor. "The truth is that some part of me was waiting, hoping, believing that one day—" He could not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Isabel's lips found his, and the 7 years that had separated them collapsed into nothing. A dream, a memory, a pause between heartbeats. When they finally drew apart, Thomas found that he was laughing and weeping at the same time, and Isabel was doing the same, and neither of them could quite believe what was happening. "This is madness," she said, but she was smiling. "Complete madness," he agreed. "The world will talk. They will say I have debased myself, married beneath my station, thrown away everything for a former monk with no name and no fortune. They will say that, and worse." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears from her cheeks. "Does it matter?" Isabel was quiet for a long moment. Then she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It does not matter. Nothing matters except this. Except you." And Thomas Ashford, who had sacrificed everything for love and been rewarded only with loss, finally understood what his mother had meant. Some gifts were worth waiting for. Some prayers took years to be answered. And some loves, however impossible, found their way home in the end. They were married in a small chapel on the outskirts of Southwell, with only the abbot and a handful of monks as witnesses. The ceremony was simple. No flowers, no music, no guests of noble birth watching from the pews. Just a man and a woman standing before an altar, speaking vows that had been written on their hearts long before they were ever spoken aloud. Isabel wore a gown of deep blue, not the color of mourning, but the color of the midnight sky she had worn on the first night they met. Thomas wore the simple clothes of a scholar, his monk's robe set aside along with the life they represented. "With this ring, I thee wed." The words echoed in the vaulted space, simple and profound and utterly final. They did not return to York. That chapter of their lives was closed, sealed behind them like a door that could never be reopened. Instead, they traveled south to a small manor house in Surrey that had been part of Isabel's personal fortune, a property the Duke had never cared about, too modest for his grand ambitions. There, among rolling hills and orchards heavy with autumn fruit, they began their life together. It was not the existence that either of them had imagined. Thomas missed the library, the manuscripts, the company of learned men who spoke Greek and Latin as easily as English. Isabel missed the elegance of her former life, the servants who anticipated her every need, the social whirl of London society that she had once navigated with such grace. But they had each other, and that, they discovered, was enough. Young Edward visited when he could, traveling from Pemberton House with his uncle's permission and his tutor's reluctant blessing. He was a bright child, curious and kind, with Thomas's dark eyes and Isabel's stubborn chin. He did not know the truth of his parentage, he would never know, but he loved the man his mother had married, the scholar who taught him Latin verbs and the names of the stars, who took him fishing in the stream that ran behind the house, who told him stories of saints and heroes with equal enthusiasm. "Will you teach me to read Greek?" Edward asked one afternoon, as they sat together in the small study that Thomas had claimed for his books. "My tutors say it is too difficult, but I don't believe them." Thomas smiled, remembering another student he had once been, another library where dreams had been born. "Of course," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." And as Edward's face lit up with delight, Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening, a release, as if a knot that had been tied 7 years ago was finally coming undone. He was not Edward's father. Not in the eyes of the world, not in any way that could ever be acknowledged. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between duty and performance, he could be something almost as precious. He could be the man who taught him to love learning. He could be the man who showed him what quiet courage looked like. He could be the man who loved his mother, truly, completely, without reservation, and in doing so, taught him what love was supposed to be. Years flowed past like water in a stream, carrying Thomas and Isabel through seasons of joy and sorrow, through challenges weathered and victories won. Edward grew to manhood and claimed his title, becoming a duke who was beloved by his tenants for his fairness and his generosity, a man who bore little resemblance to the cold aristocrat who had nominally been his father. He married a woman he loved, a merchant's daughter whose wit and warmth matched his own, and though the match raised eyebrows among the nobility, Edward did not care. He had learned from his mother that love was worth more than station, that courage was more valuable than convention, that the truest nobility lay not in blood, but in character. Thomas and Isabel watched it all from their small manor in Surrey, growing old together in the quiet contentment that had been denied them for so long. Thomas's hair turned silver, then white. Isabel's face softened with the lines that come from years of laughter more than sorrow. They walked together through the orchards in autumn, sat together by the fire in winter, held hands in the garden as spring unfolded its green miracle once more. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabel asked one evening, as they sat on the terrace watching the sun sink below the hills. Her voice was softer now, touched with the huskiness of age, but still the same voice that had whispered his name in the firelight so many years ago. "Leaving the monastery, giving up your vocation, choosing me." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he had once given to manuscripts and medical texts. "I think," he said finally, "that the monastery gave me what I needed when I needed it. Shelter, purpose, a place to heal. But you—" He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright with a love that had only deepened with time. "You gave me what I was always searching for, even when I did not know it. You gave me home." Isabel leaned her head against his shoulder, her fingers finding his in the fading light. "I never thought I would have this," she said quietly. "When I was young, when I was sold into marriage like a piece of property, I thought this kind of happiness was only for stories, only for other people. And now? Now I know that stories are born from truth." She lifted her head and kissed him softly. "And that the truest stories are the ones we write with our lives." The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving behind a sky painted in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the orchard, a nightingale began to sing, the first song of evening, heralding the coming darkness. But for Thomas and Isabel, the darkness held no fear. They had walked through it once before, hand in hand, and emerged into the light. Whatever shadows remained, they would face together, as they always had, as they always would. Many years after Thomas and Isabel had passed from this world, their grandson, Edward's son, now an old man himself, was going through the papers in the manor house that had been left to him by his grandmother's will. In a hidden drawer of the writing desk, beneath a false bottom that had concealed it for decades, he found a bundle of letters tied with a crimson ribbon. The paper was old, yellowed with age, fragile as autumn leaves. But the handwriting was still legible, a woman's elegant script on some, a man's scholarly hand on others. The letters told a story. They spoke of desperation and sacrifice, of a single night that had changed everything, of love that had been forced underground and finally, against all odds, allowed to bloom. They spoke of secrets kept and truths buried, of a child who had never known the identity of his true father, of choices made in darkness that had led, somehow, to light. The old man read the letters 3 times, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. He had known that his grandmother and her second husband shared a love beyond the ordinary. He had seen it in the way they looked at each other, the way they moved together like 2 notes in the same chord. But he had never known the price they had paid for that love. He had never understood the weight of what they carried. When he finished reading, he sat for a long time in the quiet study, listening to the wind move through the trees outside, thinking about the nature of sacrifice and the resilience of the human heart. Then, carefully, he returned the letters to their hiding place. Some stories were meant to remain secret. Some loves were too precious to be exposed to the harsh light of public judgment. His grandmother had kept these letters hidden for a reason, to protect the memory of a man she had loved, to shield the legacy of a son who had never needed to know the truth. That protection, that shielding, was a gift he could continue to give. But as he closed the drawer and rose to leave the study, the old man paused at the window. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, soft, silent, covering the world in a blanket of white. He smiled. Some loves, he thought, are eternal, even when they cannot be spoken, even when they must be hidden from the world. That is what makes them sacred. That is what makes them true.